There are places in this world where the shadows whisper, where the wind carries voices that do not belong to the living. Places that exist beyond the reach of light, where ancient horrors lurk just out of sight, waiting for those foolish enough to wander too close. Tonight, we step into the darkness. 4 terrifying tales of the unseen, the cursed, and the forsaken. Stories of campers who ventured too far and discovered that some legends are real, some nightmares never end, and some entities are still watching. Are you ready to hear the truth? Then sit back, turn off the lights, and listen closely. But beware, some stories have a way of staying with you long after they're told. Story 1. Skinwalkers Camping. Horror deep within the vast, untouched wilderness of the American Southwest lies a region whispered about in hushed tones by the indigenous tribes who have lived there for generations. A place where even the most seasoned hunters refuse to tread after nightfall. They say the land is cursed, a domain ruled not by man, but by ancient beings who lurk just beyond the veil of darkness. Tonight, we venture into this forbidden place to recount the horrifying tale of a group of campers who came face to face with something that should not exist, something that defied the boundaries of human understanding. The 4 friends, Josh, Emily, Sam, and Eric, had set out on what they believed would be an unforgettable weekend deep in the wild. The promise of an isolated camping experience away from the noise of civilization was too tempting to resist. They had been warned by locals to avoid certain areas, to never speak of the things that roamed those lands, but they laughed it off as nothing more than superstition. By late afternoon, they arrived at their chosen site, a secluded clearing surrounded by towering pines. The sun dipped low in the sky as they set up camp, the golden light filtering through the dense foliage in long, eerie beams. They built a fire, cooked their meals, and enjoyed the serenity of nature. As the sky darkened, a strange stillness settled over the forest. The usual sounds of chirping insects and rustling leaves seemed to vanish, replaced by an unnatural quiet. Sam, the most experienced camper among them, frowned. "It's too quiet," he muttered, but the others dismissed his concerns. Then came the first sign, a distant howl, guttural and unnatural, cutting through the silence like a blade. Not the cry of a wolf or coyote, but something deeper, something more human. The group exchanged uneasy glances, but rationalized it as an animal call they simply hadn't heard before. Hours passed, and the fire crackled, offering warmth against the creeping chill of the night. But just as they began to relax, the voice came. From beyond the tree line, someone called out, "Emily!" It was a soft whisper, barely audible over the fire's crackling, but unmistakable. A voice eerily familiar, mimicking Emily's own tone, yet stretched and distorted, as though spoken by lips unused to forming human words. Her blood ran cold. She turned to the others. "Did you hear that?" Before anyone could answer, another voice followed. "Sam, help me!" It was Josh's voice, but Josh was sitting right there. The group froze, their breath catching in their throats. This was no prank. Their eyes darted toward the darkness beyond the trees, but the night was impossibly black. They could see nothing beyond the fire's flickering light. A rustling sound came from the underbrush, accompanied by the snap of a twig. Then, in the dim glow of the fire, they saw movement. A figure stood at the edge of the clearing just beyond their sight, unmoving, watching. Panic set in. Sam grabbed the flashlight and aimed it at the figure. For a split second it was illuminated, a grotesque twisted shape, vaguely human but wrong. Its limbs were elongated, its skin stretched unnaturally over protruding bones. Its face was neither animal nor man, a mockery of both, and its eyes were black voids, devoid of life, yet filled with a deep, malevolent hunger. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it vanished into the shadows. The campers bolted for the tent, their breath ragged, hearts pounding. They huddled together, listening to the unnatural whispers encircling them, voices mimicking their own, calling out in perfect imitation, yet stripped of all warmth. Time became meaningless. The night stretched on, a torment of distant footfalls and inhuman laughter. At one point, Emily swore she saw something crawling on all fours just outside the tent, moving with a jerky, unnatural motion. Then, the scratching started, soft at first, a single scrape against the fabric of the tent. Then, another. Then dozens, as though unseen hands were dragging their fingers along the thin material, separating them from whatever lay outside. Morning could not come fast enough. As the first rays of sunlight filtered through the canopy, the sounds ceased. With trembling hands, they unzipped the tent. Their campsite was destroyed. Their gear was scattered, clawed at, shredded. Symbols had been etched into the dirt around them, ancient, incomprehensible markings. But the most chilling sight of all lay in the center of the clearing, a single word, written in perfect English, carved deeply into the soil. Leave. They did not need to be told twice. Abandoning whatever remained of their belongings, they ran. They ran until their legs burned, until the safety of their car came into view. They never spoke of what happened that night, never shared their story with the world. But they knew. They knew the legends were real, the warnings were true. There are places in this world that do not belong to us. Places where the old ones still walk among the trees, shifting their shapes, stealing voices, waiting for those foolish enough to trespass. And should you ever find yourself in such a place, when the night is too quiet and the voices call your name, do not answer, do not follow, and whatever you do, never look into their eyes. Story 2. The Rake's vigil. The forest always hides secrets. Stories buried under layers of dry leaves, under twisted branches that rise like skeletal fingers to the sky. But some secrets should never be discovered. It was a cold, silent night, when a group of 4 friends decided to go camping deep in an isolated forest reserve. The site had been handpicked by one of them, a wildlife enthusiast who swore that this region was one of the few places still untouched by man. The others followed enthusiastically, fascinated by the promise of an authentic experience in the midst of nature. They set up their tents beside a stream, far from any signposted trails, and sat around the campfire, sharing stories and laughter. But as the night progressed, an uncomfortable feeling began to hang in the air. It was subtle at first, like the whisper of the wind between the trees. But soon, it became something more. One of his friends, Jake, was the first to notice. He walked away from the group to collect more firewood, and when he returned, he was pale. He said he felt like he was being watched. The others laughed, joking that he was just impressed by the shadows the fire cast. But Jake's expression said otherwise. There was something in the forest, something he couldn't explain. That night, the wind ceased. No sound of crickets, no owls hooting in the distance, just absolute, heavy, suffocating silence. The friends retired to their tents, but sleep didn't come easily. Every snap of a twig, every sigh from the forest sounded too loud, too abnormal. At around 3 a.m., a noise broke the stillness. It wasn't a human sound, nor was it the sound of a familiar animal. It was a scratching, a dry, rhythmic sound, like nails being dragged against wood. It came from outside the tents, first subtle, then more insistent. One of the friends, Chris, slowly stood up and unzipped the tent just enough to peek outside. In the faint reflection of the almost extinguished campfire, he saw something. A short silhouette, too slender to be human. Elongated feet and hands, unnaturally dislocated joints. Pale, almost translucent skin, and eyes. Empty eyes. Black as an endless abyss. Chris held his breath, his heart hammering in his chest. He knew what it was. He'd heard about it before. The Rake, a creature that inhabits the darkest corners of the forest, watching, waiting, feeding on the fear of those who dare to enter its territory. The creature remained there for what seemed like an eternity. It stood still, watching. Then, in one swift, silent movement, it disappeared into the trees. Chris stepped back, panting. He tried to whisper to the others, but no one dared move. Everyone had heard. They all knew. Time dragged on until the sun began to tint the sky orange. When they finally emerged from the tents, they found the place devastated. Their backpacks had been overturned, their footprints mixed with strange marks on the ground. But the most disturbing thing was the trunk of a nearby tree. There, deeply carved into the wood, were 3 long parallel grooves, as if something had sharpened its claws there as a warning. Without saying a word, the friends dismantled their camp and left, vowing never to return. And to this day, when they hear a noise in the middle of the night, they can't help but wonder, is the Rake still watching them? Or maybe he's just waiting for the next watch. Story 3. Children of night. In the deep wilderness, far from the reach of civilization, a group of campers ventured into an untouched expanse of forest. They were seasoned adventurers, drawn to the mystery of nature's embrace. Their destination was a forgotten campsite near a stagnant lake, a place long abandoned, where whispers of old legends still lingered in the rustling leaves. The first day passed uneventfully. They pitched their tents, gathered firewood, and shared stories around the crackling fire. As the sun dipped below the treetops, an uneasy stillness settled over the forest, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Then, as darkness swallowed the landscape, the whispers began. At first, they were soft, indistinct murmurs carried on the wind. The campers dismissed them as the sounds of the night, branches swaying, the distant hoot of an owl. But as the hours passed, the whispers grew more distinct, weaving together in an eerie harmony. They seemed to encircle the campsite, speaking in hushed, childlike voices. One of the campers, a skeptic by nature, stood and called out into the void, challenging whatever was lurking beyond the firelight. Silence followed, a pause so profound that even the wind seemed to falter. Then laughter, light, breathy giggles, not of men or women, but of children. It echoed from the trees, moving unnaturally from one spot to another, impossible to track. The group exchanged uneasy glances, their bravado quickly dissolving. The skeptic, attempting to prove there was nothing to fear, grabbed a flashlight and stepped toward the woods. The beam cut through the thick shadows, revealing only gnarled roots and swaying branches. But just as he was about to turn back, something moved. Small figures darted between the trees, too quick, too fluid to be human. Their silhouettes were faint, as if they were only half there, their forms flickering like candle flames. The skeptic took a step forward, the hairs on his neck rising. That was when he saw them. Just beyond the reach of the light, a circle of children stood, their eyes empty voids reflecting the beam. Their faces were pale, skin stretched too tightly over their bones. They did not blink, did not move, only stared, their lips curling into frozen, unnatural grins. The skeptic stumbled back, his breath hitching in his throat. The firelight behind him dimmed, as if the darkness itself was pressing inward. The whispers grew louder, swirling around him like a tangible force. Then a single voice, clear and piercing, cut through the cacophony. "Come play with us." He turned and bolted back to the campsite, his panic infecting the others. The trees trembled as though alive, branches clawing at the sky. The campers huddled, together, gripping whatever makeshift weapons they could find. The night stretched on in a nightmare haze. Shadows moved where there should have been none. Footsteps circled the tents, stopping just outside, accompanied by giggles that never wavered. Each time someone dared to peek outside, they saw nothing, but the presence never left. Then, as dawn's first light crept over the treetops, the whispers ceased. The air, once thick with unseen terror, felt lighter. The campers wasted no time. They packed up, their hands shaking, their eyes darting to the tree line where figures had once lurked. As they turned to leave, one of them froze. There, in the dirt where their tents had stood, were dozens of tiny handprints, imprinted deep, as if pressed by something that had no intention of letting them go. They never spoke of that night again. But in their dreams, the laughter lingered. A constant reminder that in those woods, something ancient and hungry still waited for its next playmates. Story 4. The Wail of La Llorona. The desert air was dry, carrying the scent of dust and sagebrush. A group of 5 campers had set up near the Rio Grande, a place where the wind whispered in hushed tones through the canyon walls. Miguel, the most seasoned camper of the group, had chosen the location for its remoteness, its silence, a perfect retreat from the noise of the modern world. But he failed to mention the stories he had grown up hearing, the ones whispered by his abuela late at night, the ones about her. The first night was uneventful, a quiet evening under the stars, the crackling fire painting flickering shadows on the surrounding rocks. They spoke in hushed tones, listening to the distant call of a coyote, the rustling of unseen creatures in the brush. But as the darkness deepened, an uneasy tension settled over the group. The wind had shifted, carrying with it a strange, almost melodic cry, faint but distinct, like a woman weeping in the distance. By morning, they laughed it off. The desert had its own sounds, Miguel assured them. The wind could play tricks on the ears, twisting through the rocks like voices. But deep down, he knew better. The second night, the crying returned. It started softly, blending with the rustling of the trees, but soon it grew. Long, sorrowful wails stretching across the canyon. It was closer this time, more distinct. It no longer sounded like the wind, but a voice filled with anguish. The sound was coming from the river. Miguel felt his stomach tighten. He had heard these stories as a child, and they all spoke of one thing: La Llorona, the weeping woman, the cursed mother who had drowned her own children in a fit of jealousy and rage, now doomed to wander the earth searching for them. Anyone who heard her cries was in danger, and those who saw her never returned. Trying to dismiss his fears, Miguel convinced the others it was nothing, a trick of the desert, a distant animal call. But the next morning, strange footprints appeared near their campsite. Bare, wet, as if someone had walked straight out of the river and stood watching them in the night. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the crying began even earlier, closer, more distinct. It was no longer a distant wail, but a lamentation that wrapped itself around their souls, chilling them from within. Then, something moved at the edge of the water. Miguel's breath caught in his throat. A figure, draped in tattered white garments, stood there, her head bowed, her hair cascading over her face like a mourning veil. Her presence felt heavy, suffocating, as if the very air had thickened. She lifted her face just enough for Miguel to see her hollow eyes, her mouth twisted in agony as she whispered, "Mis hijos, ¿dónde están mis hijos?" Panic gripped him as he turned to warn his friends, but they were already staring, frozen in place. Then, as if responding to their terror, the woman moved. Her body shifted unnaturally, gliding forward without taking a step. The fire flickered violently, casting long shadows as the air grew heavy with the scent of stagnant water. One of the campers, Javier, let out a strangled gasp and stumbled backward. The woman's head snapped toward him, her cries shifting into an otherworldly scream, high-pitched, deafening, filled with unfathomable sorrow and rage. The air itself seemed to vibrate with her grief. Miguel reacted first. "We have to go, now!" They scrambled to their feet, grabbing whatever they could, as the wailing figure moved closer. The temperature plummeted, their breaths visible in the dim light. As they fled into the darkness, the cries followed, chasing them through the uneven terrain. The desert, vast and open, felt like it was closing in on them. Then, a sudden silence. They stopped, panting, their chests heaving with exhaustion. The only sound was the blood pounding in their ears. The river was no longer in sight, the campfire only a distant ember. For a moment, they thought they had escaped, but something was missing. "Where is Javier?" The realization crashed over them like a wave of ice. They spun around, calling his name, their voices swallowed by the night. No response, no movement, only the stillness of the desert. Miguel turned toward the river. The moon cast a pale glow on the rippling water, and there, standing just at the edge of the shore, was the figure. She was not alone. A second figure stood beside her, a shadow barely formed, wavering in the dim light. Javier. His expression was vacant, his body unnaturally still. And then, without a sound, he turned and walked with her into the water. Miguel screamed his friend's name, but no sound came from his throat. He stumbled forward, but the others held him back. The water swallowed them whole, the ripples vanishing. As if nothing had ever disturbed its surface, they ran. By the time they reached their vehicle, the sun had begun to rise, painting the desert in hues of gold and crimson. But there was no warmth in it, only the hollow echo of the night before. They returned with search teams the next morning. No sign of Javier, no footprints, no struggle. Only the sound of the river, whispering the same mournful song of a mother searching for her lost children. Miguel never went camping again. But sometimes, in the quiet moments just before sleep, he swears he still hears it, that sorrowful cry drifting through the night, calling for children that will never return. Now you know their stories, the ones who heard the whispers, the ones who saw the shadows move, the ones who never came back. But what if these aren't just stories? What if the next time you go camping, the next time you hear a voice calling, from the woods, a whisper outside your tent, it isn't your imagination, when the night is too silent, when something watches from the darkness? Will you remember these warnings? Or will you become the next story we tell? If you dare to. Hear more, subscribe now, and click the link below. But be careful, because once you enter this world, the darkness never lets you go.